So, John, in what year did safety officers kind of come on board with the Ottawa Fire Department?
You know what? I'd have to look up the specific date, but it was 92, 93, or 94. And we were first assigned to the training division. And there's a lot of training we had to receive to hone our skills. You brought a bunch of experience with you. In my case, probably the most of all the safety officers in the practical skill, in so much as I was on the senior man's list to be promoted, and there were others who brought different expertise to that, the five of us, to that area. Not as much on-ground experience, a little bit less, but perhaps building construction was one individual was very, very knowledgeable in building construction. You can see how that would be an asset also. So in the early years, when we were attached to the training division, we learned about joint health and safety committees. We learned about industrial hygiene. We learned about at-source air capturing. We taught ourselves more or less, because if you can imagine, when you get onto a computer and you research stuff, every door you open, there were 5 doors behind that you could pursue down to gain knowledge in. We made reports. And then if you take the people who are in charge, the senior officers who have a wealth of fireground experience, much so more than us, and now they have this young pup in a new position with the authority of the deputy chief coming on to their fireground and going to tell them what to do. So it wasn't a smooth transition. And what had to happen was the safety officers of the time had to earn the respect of the men in the station for the work that they did. Yes, some of it was painful. Some of it was bad, and there were challenges of disciplinary action that was going to be taken. And all that you had to find the root cause of why things happened. So we were able to investigate incidents and find out why it really happened. Why did this accident occur? So you take and you found all the dominoes that fell over to make the accident happen. And was it the firefighter who was in the shower in the morning and going to drive the truck who said, "Oh, today is going to be a great day, I'm going to smash up the truck"? No. So did we not give him the skills to perform in the situation we wanted him to perform in? More likely the case. So we identified areas of training that had to be done, and often challenged the experts in the field, whether it was trench rescue, whether it was hazmat, whether it was water rescue, high angle, all of those areas. Those are the experts. So they write the procedures, and then we would go to the scene and enforce the procedures that they came up with. And if it had to be changed, it's a living thing. They could change it. But you don't change it in the middle of a scene. I remember one instance in particular. We're doing responding to a water rescue. A person reported on the ice flows of the Rideau River around Montreal Road. So the launch site is quite a bit north of that towards City Hall. So the water rescue goes down there and they're going to launch the boat. Now there's a procedure with the boat, but the procedure for a launch is written in the summertime when you're backing the boat down a boat launch, and you have a guy in the pickup truck, a guy standing on the side, and a guy in the boat as they're backing. But we're talking a situation where there's ice. So it's much different and more challenging. The end result was, in the procedure that the water rescue had written, you start the motor before it leaves the trailer. That way you're not going down the river with the ice flow. And what happened was, that didn't happen. So the poor individual in the boat is going down the river with the ice flow trying to start the engine. So it became a bit of a panic. So I went to the Minto Bridges at City Hall from this launch site and was standing by with my knife to cut the nets that hang off the window bridges just in case he didn't get it started. But he did get it started. And came back to shore, picked up the rest of the crew, and they searched, and it ended up there was no individual on the ice flow. But that's the type of thing that could happen, and that's the role that the safety officer played in that particular situation. So then, how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? So we used to have something that used to be called the post-incident critique. Well, that's a negative connotation, so post-incident analysis is what we called it. So you then, in your safety officer's role, you go back to the station to be involved in the post-incident analysis, and in my case, you're the last one to talk. And when the people who performed whatever service they performed to the taxpayer, when it went around the room, typically they would pick up any errors or omissions that happened on the scene and correct it themselves, so the safety officer didn't have to do anything. And if not, then there was a suggestion put forward that perhaps we could do it better in the future this way. Many years of not pointing fingers and not being judgmental and enforcing the rules, per se, that the firefighters make themselves, you gain the trust. And then now it's at the level that it is today. When you look at the Safety and Innovation Division of the Ottawa Fire Service and the Ottawa Fire Service itself, it's remarkable what these people are doing.
So a lot of the safety officers, but it was a role for everybody to make sure that everybody went home safe, and all firefighters watched each other's backs back then, both rural and...
Typically, we didn't have accountability.
No. And did accountability come out shortly? When I talk about accountability, because we talked about safety back 100 years ago, when firefighters were watching the walls, making sure that they weren't going to fall over and collapse. But did accountability and what we call rapid intervention or RIT teams come out roughly about the same time as safety?
Safety was, we were in the training center, and I was tasked with accountability. So what did that mean? So that meant that I researched Seattle, Phoenix, the European or British system of accountability, and I studied them and I learned how they functioned. And then when I was tasked with that, I made the important point to my supervisor at the time, who was the chief of training, that it had to be the firefighters that built the system. If they didn't build it, it wouldn't work. They had to have ownership, and I just had to work as their resource and be in their stations. So he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, so I have to go on shift or meet with these guys on shift so that they can develop this. So I did it partially on days, and some evenings I went. And very fortunately, I knew John Carrier, who was a district chief at the time, and he was a very forward-thinking officer, and he was actually responsible for bringing water rescue to the Ottawa Fire Service through the Red Cross and life-saving, and and John was, there was so many things he touched that grew on to be bigger and better things. So I approached him with the challenge, and he was the Eastern District Chief, and he says, yeah, bring it into my stations. So I sat down with the guys in the stations and I said, so here's the 3 systems that they have in Phoenix, Seattle, and in Europe. And these are how they work. How are we going to make one for us? Well, how are we going to make a system? I said, you just tell me. So I got little bits of plastic and Velcro, and for a while they called me Captain Velcro, because everything I did touched Velcro. I put Velcro on the helmets, and if you look at the firefighters going down the road today, their assignment is on the side of their helmet. So when you look at firefighters at a fire scene, you will see 3 or 4 heads bobbling together, and they've all got the same numbers on their helmets. When the truck goes down the road and the numbers on the truck, that's the crew that they're assigned to. So you've got them identified as a group. You take that group, you put it on the truck, so the first in has a passport on the truck, but the firefighters in the station developed all that. They sat down with the rough tools that came from the departments, and the reason they came from the departments like Phoenix and like Seattle was because those departments lost firefighters because they didn't know where they were. And the firefighters would be lost in a single-family home, and they just didn't know he was in there. I mean, it's only drywall and boards. Yeah. Any firefighter worth his spit can go through drywall and boards with his bare hands.
And it was the smartest thing they ever did was Velcro on helmets. to be accountable for what truck
It wasn't
you're
me.
with. No,
It was the firefighters that developed it.
exactly. Yeah. And
Toronto used magnets,
Yeah.
but every time you dropped your helmet, the magnet fell off. So these firefighters turned around, and we actually, one officer in the station turned around and said, well, you got trucks transporting hazardous materials, and they have that sign that you can change on the trucks, so let's make the first ones like that. So we did. And then we evolved into different, somebody come up with a better idea, and we had magnetic ships, and it was absolutely one of the most gratifying things I ever experienced, was having the firefighters develop their own.
Awesome.
So then we had a new fire chief at the time, Gary Richardson, who was a very forward-thinking fire chief, and he came with a university degree, and his claim to fame was he wrote a thesis in university about amalgamating fire and ambulance, which was quite groundbreaking at the time, in the 90s. So that's how forward-thinking he was. So he called a meeting, and we made a presentation at the executive chief level in the boardroom, and all the executive chiefs, and there were some executive chiefs up there that had stopped growing in their minds. They had achieved their level, they were waiting for retirement, and why change? If it's not broke, don't fix it. And I actually brought, I remember John Carrier at this meeting. So I turn around, and I've got the flip charts, and I've got the little passports, and I'm explaining all this kind of stuff, and I'm enthusiastic because the guys in the station put this together, and I'm presenting it. It was amazing, and I showed them how this worked and how that worked. And then one of the officers who didn't understand liability and how it would keep track of firefighters on the fire ground stood up and started to attack the concept, and it was stupid, and and I remember John Carrier rising out of his seat, and he stood up and defended that with a very impassioned speech. If you can imagine, if you knew John and he was behind something, he was very passionate about how this would work, and this guy didn't know what he was talking about, and so on. So here's a captain, acting district, fighting a deputy chief or an executive officer. And it was something to see. And right then, I realized that it was going to fly because there was a firefighter defending it.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely amazing.
Now you speak of John
What do they
Carrier.
call those? Watersheds?
Watersheds.
Yeah, the paradigm shift, watershed?
I don't know.
Let's use all the big words.
Absolutely. Now you speak of John Carrier, and these are amazing names, because John passed away a few years ago, and he was very influential in what we call the Bytown Fire Brigade. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the Bytown Fire Brigade in a further video when we talk about the steamer and things like that. But could you share a little bit about the Bytown Fire Brigade and this old truck that you used to have, and some of the parades, and what did you do, John? I mean, I remember you back from the 80s being on the Bytown Fire Brigade. Of course, we had hair, and it was a little darker.
Yeah, we had hair. Well, we were young, and our families were young, and in 1983 or so, perhaps before that, there was a group of people who were interested in the fire service and enthusiastic about the fire service. So, again, it goes to George Potvin. And he started rebuilding his truck. And then there was firefighters from Nepean, Jack Brabazon and his family, and John Carrier and his family, and Brian Murphy and his family, and enthusiastic. So we had these antique trucks. So George had a fifth wheel. We'd put the antique truck on the fifth wheel, and we'd go to musters. And we usually end up in the northern United States. Fairville, New York comes to mind. We went down there 2-3 times a year. You brought your whole family, you camped, and you had nothing but fun. One summer, they got a keg of beer, and they put the keg of beer inside another large drum and filled it with ice. So the beer was cold. We had to go back 3 separate occasions to Fairville, New York to finish drinking all that beer. At the time, George was famous for his incredible yellow bird.
I've heard stories about that, John.
Yes. He had this outfit. You have to know George Potvin. The imagination is unlimited. He put on a fire prevention show at the Saint Laurent Shopping Center that we called the Grand Spectacle. If you imagine the whole walking area of the Saint Laurent Shopping Center completely full of firematic displays and fire prevention for Fire Prevention Week. We brought in an aerial ladder and put it up in the dome and locked it into position. But to get it in past the exit signs, we had to deflate the tires so that it cleared, bringing a ladder truck into a shopping mall.
I've seen the pictures, and I'm excited about you talking about it, because certainly I'll include those pictures, a couple of those pictures, in this video. I've seen the aerial in the Saint Laurent Shopping Center, and it's raised, and I thought, how did they ever get it in there? So they had to deflate the tires.
Deflate the tires to get it in. Then when you got it in position, you had to reinflate the tires. And then, this probably predates ladder inspections, where every year you have to go and get your aerial, again, safety, you have to get your aerial certified. So they just cranked this old aerial up, extended the ladder right up and started it up, set all the detectors off in the mall while this thing's running, right? And then locked down the aerial in the extended position. And it was a sight to behold.
And so 37 years, this is the end of the 37th year of the Bytown Fire Brigade. And it's still going strong, and you're still a member.
Yep.
And certainly with that comes a lot of knowledge and antiques. And one of them is a truck that you've actually, Bytown has now.
We'll talk about it. Before we go there, I'm going to say that we went over some pretty lean years. The Bytown Fire Brigade, not only did we do summer camping every year for all the families, and that just grew it because we were a group. And we got older, and it fell off. And now there's a resurgence. We're over the hump. Now the stuff that we have is really interesting because it's really old. You know, it's not like having a 2005 fire truck that's decommissioned. Now some of our stuff is turn of the century, 1950s, 1930s, 1920s. It's absolutely amazing, and it's really interesting.
Well, next year we have one that's turning 100.
There you go.
Yeah. And you've got it.
So I followed in the footsteps of Dave Fitzsimons, Brian Murphy, George Potvin, John Carrier, and bought my own fire truck. With these pieces, there's so much work in restoring them that it takes months, years, and you can only have so much spare time. So what you do is you work on it for 2 months straight, and then you stop. And you typically a burnout. And then in the months that you're off, you go and resource parts, and you find parts here and parts there to make them better. And then you go back at it, you sand another piece down, and you paint another piece. You sandblast this, you fix that. So I was lucky enough to buy off Jimmy Walsh a 1928 Buffalo fire apparatus. What is that? Well, Buffalo, New York. They decided to make fire apparatus. And they started out making extinguishers, and now they made full custom, in 1928 they made full custom trucks, because in 1927 they bought the Larrabee Truck Chassis Manufacturing Plant, and they put Hale pumps on it. Hale pumps fired by driven by a Continental Red Seal engine. So I managed to get this truck. It didn't have the old Continental Red Seal in it anymore, but it had a Hercules W, which is a 1934 flathead 6-cylinder engine, typically found in cabin cruisers of the 60s or earlier, and Huff loaders. So parts were available. So Dave Fitzsimons, with his expertise, he's a machinist, don't you know, And he helped me rebuild the engine, and the engine runs like a top. It's absolutely pristine. So for many years I worked on it, and it sat in the garage again to the demise of the Harley. You've only got, you either play golf or ride a Harley, or ride your antique fire truck, or be a volunteer firefighter, or ride your Harley. You can't do both, especially if you're putting on hundreds of thousands of miles. Going across all of North America, empty nesters, the kids are gone, so guess what? We're out of here. We're out of Dodge. We're going here. So I restored this, and it sat dormant for quite a few years, and Bytown Fire Brigade and myself reached an agreement, and it is now part of their collection. And I will be doing a video at a future date where I go into great detail about the truck. It's absolutely an amazing piece of engineering marvel, in so much as it had mechanical brakes. So when you push the brake lever, levers and rods that are all adjusted operate shoes on the back wheels only, because they hadn't figured out how to make the front wheels turn and brake at the same time. So it's only got back brakes. A piece of information about the truck, and I believe we're going to do this at a later date also, but it's a rotary gear pump. So what that means is it's a positive displacement pump, in so much as it can draft water like crazy, but it can't take advantage of a fire hydrant. So you hook it up to a fire hydrant, the water rushes right into the pump and stops dead and won't come out of hose line. So you have to throttle the pump up to get any pressure out of it as fast. It doesn't matter if it's got a captured water source, which is a porta tank, or whether you've got the suction in a river, lake, or stream. The throttle setting is what controls the amount of water. It's a 600 gallon per minute pump, and it will. I took it down to the water here in Manotick at the aquatic club, and I threw the suctions in the water, and I supplied a deluge gun in like about 3 seconds. It pumps water that fast, but it can't take advantage of a hydrant. So technology marched on, and we ended up now today all pumps are centrifugal, because most municipalities have water sources. So, and those have to require primers, and this one here doesn't need a primer. The primer on this, actually all it does is it oils the gears so that there's no wear on them. It's an interesting piece. I made a fake hose bed on the back. It'll transport 11 or 12 people, again with the Bytown Fire Brigade. I had bench seats in the back, and if you can imagine, in the 80s and the 90s, going down Rito Street to Nate's for a smoked meat, you caused quite a commotion parking in that parking lot. Another item I want to talk about is, so my kids were teenagers, and they had a bunch of kids over, and I says, let's go for a drive in the truck. So I put a dozen teenagers in my truck and was driving all around Barrhaven before it was really developed. And sure enough, I got pulled over by a police officer. And he's quite angry. He says, well, what do you think you're doing? Like, so here's this 60-year-old fire truck driving around, and they're ringing the bell and sounding the siren, but it doesn't sound anything like fire apparatus of the 80s. And so he said, what are you doing? I says, well, I'm amusing these teenagers. And he says, well, do you not realize that you're in a lot of trouble? I says, what for? He says, well, if anything happens, it's going to be criminal negligence causing harm or death. And I go, well, I weighed that, but I said, I came to the conclusion that I have a dozen teenagers riding around in a truck having the time of their lives, and they're in a drug and alcohol-free environment. So, well, he says, where do you live? And I says, well, I live, and he says, well, you better get home as quickly as you can. So, everything relative, but that's what the Bytown Fire Brigade was all about having a good time.
Absolutely. Parades,
musters,
lots of different things.
History. It sounds very boring when you say history, but actually if you bracket history and you say, okay, well, technology, and the beauty of the Bytown Fire Brigade is with each of their apparatus. If you take the hand pumper, The hand pumper was in service for probably 30 or 40 years. But that was leading edge technology at that time.
Yeah.
And then you advance and you've got horse-drawn, steam-driven fire apparatus. And that's another 30-year bracket of technology. The mechanical age, where everything was turned into mechanics. And then you go beyond that, and it's motorized fire apparatus, where you actually took a gasoline engine and drove the pump and the vehicle to the fire scene.
So talking about the motorized vehicle, again, the year that you got on, John, was what?
Ottawa Fire Service, 1974.
So what was the very first truck? Do you remember the very first truck that you drove? That you actually
Yes, I do.
You do?
I was at number 5 station, as I said, old number 5 on St. Laurent Boulevard. Johnny Morell was the captain, and I was just the green, maybe 6 months on the job. And I'm in the station. Jerry Hill was there. Dave Moffat. At some point, Dave Smith was there. He was the senior man. A lesson I learned from Dave Smith as he's on his hands and knees with steel wool, cleaning the old wax off the floor, doing the floor. So when a man's doing that, and then he becomes deputy chief of the fire service, you have to respect him. So Johnny Morell says to me one day, it was a city service ladder truck, which is again a unique piece of equipment in so much as it was made in Ottawa. It had a Dodge commercial chassis on the front. It was 20-some feet long, and it was all full of ground ladders. So he says, come on, young lad. He says, we're going for driver training. And I says, well, I've never driven this kind. He says, don't worry. He was a French guy. First language was obviously French, but what a wonderful human being. Gets in the truck, and I says, but Captain, you're supposed to be in charge of the pump. He says, I'm in charge of the station. He says, they're not going anywhere without me. So he said, I says, well, where are we going? He says, well, we're going back to my place. What for? I forgot my glasses. So I get into the truck, I drive around the block, and I go to his house and pick up his glasses. And that was my first experience driving this ladder truck. Another experience on that ladder truck is usually the junior guy is on the side of the ladder truck where he can get into the least harm. You're not having a hose line. You're not on the pump yet because you're too green. And you get told what to do all the time. You can be a dumb guy and throw a ladder up, right? I get on the side of the ladder truck. It's a cold, wintry night. We drive down St. Laurent Boulevard, turn left on Russell Road and go way out Russell Road to a fire. I get to the fire. The lieutenant steps out of the cab and he gives me an order. I says, I can't do that. Why? I says, I can't move. He says, what do you mean you can't move? I'm frozen. So with the long coat, if you can imagine, and the tall boots on, hanging on the side of a ladder truck. This was a deluxe version because it had the cage around you to protect you from falling off. But riding on the sideboard of the truck, all the way to the fire, frozen stiff, couldn't move. I was looking at a picture the other day of our group in the early 90s, C group, in front of the Parliament buildings. Kenny McKibben was the officer. And Richard Renault is wearing a pair of fireball gloves. They were orange gloves that we were issued. So when I came on the job in 1974, equipping a firefighter from head to toe cost the City of Ottawa $110. The black patch coat, the tall rubber boots, the fireball gloves, the hose key belt and ladder strap that everybody was issued and you hung in the station with care every night at the end of your shift, and the plastic construction style helmet, $110. The interesting part about the fireball gloves is at a fire on O'Connor Street, an old building, we were doing searches. We weren't sure that the building was empty. So you practiced searches all the time. You did it clockwise. You made sure that they knew you were doing it clockwise so that if they had to come and find you, they'd know where to find you. You go in, you can't see anything, can't see your hand in front of your house, your hand in front of your face. You have breathing apparatus on, may or may not. You're searching the floor and you're using your body to make as wide an arch as you can to check the center of the floor. And if the foot was too big, you would do a crisscross pattern to catch the center of the room. But you're doing the perimeter and you're going along, making sure you know where the windows are in case you have to use them to get out. But you're feeling the windowsill with your hand. And I remember feeling the windowsill, and it felt slippery. And there was no water inside, and I couldn't figure out why it was so slippery. I thought the paint was melting. Got outside and looked, my gloves were melting.
Oh my.
That's how hot it was. At the windowsill level. Never mind the ceiling, but you're on your hands and knees. Anyway, the experiences you go through. Then there was a terrible fire on Sherwood Drive. The firefighters were injured once again. And they started to really look at the fire gear we were wearing. And Pat DeFazio, who was instrumental in changing the fire service, was instrumental in from the union side, creating the CGSB, Canadian Government Standards Bureau, which rated structural firefighting gear. And they came up with the terms of TPP, like thermal protective properties of different kinds of garments. And they started off in some of the garments that they brought from NASA, from the space program, to test for fire service. And then decide on the thermal protective properties that a firefighter needed without having so much that he cooked inside the fire gear, because as he's moving, he's creating heat, and he would just build up metabolic heat inside of him. So,
well, some of the bunker gear that came out in the mid-'80s in a lot of the rural areas, a lot of the rural fire departments, such as Osgood and Rideau, the Ottawa Fire Department was one of the last ones to get bunker gear.
That's because of the standard that they were growing the standard before. When you purchased the gear, it was an unknown, it met no standard. A lot of guys on the fire service, Jimmy Corrigan comes to mind, very forward thinking, he bought the nylon looking bunker gear and wore it on the job. But then it became an issue of, so if that firefighter is injured wearing something that wasn't issued by the fire service, who is liable? So you can see where the argument goes back and forth, whereas if you're in a rural, and you go in the rural environment, you're buying a dozen sets of bunker gear. It's not the same impact as buying 800 in the municipal environment. And municipal money, you have to justify it before it gets spent. You have to make a budget. You have to make a standard. You have to see that it meets a standard. We did it all with breathing apparatus.
And that's the safety in you coming out again, John.
It is.
Absolutely. I've had a tremendous learning experience here with having you share some of the memories of your time at the fire department. This is not going to end here. Certainly, when we get over to the museum and we get you to walk through the steamers, I want to find out a little bit more about some of the equipment that we have at the Bytown Museum, Bytown Fire Brigade Museum. And certainly I want to find out a little bit more about some of the calls that you went on, some of the antics that took place. We can conclude for today, but
with a story?
Doesn't end here.
I'm going to give you a story.
I want to hear a story. I want to hear a story.
So that picture that I showed you earlier in front of Parliament Hill, which you can go and see on the website, which will probably end up being posted in this video. That group of characters. So Dave Logan, the huge guy in that picture, a monster of a man, he was called the NW Root Beer because he walked just like the NW. But that was Logan, and he was like that. And what a monster of a man, and a good guy. And the fun that went on. So there was a time at number 2 when we had a particular captain that was in charge of the station, and this captain was one of the strongest men I'd ever see. He would take the hard suctions and put them on. When he was driving the pump, he'd take them off and put them on himself, which is a 2-man job. But he pressed weights, and everybody watching this video is going to know who I'm talking about. But he was self-conscious about going bald. And his hair was receding. But you never, ever mentioned that because he would retaliate. So we're in the kitchen, and we cooked all our meals in the kitchen of old number 2 Bay and Lisgar, keeping in mind that the diesel emissions used to go through the screen door and land on the plate of food that you were eating. And by the end of the summer, the screen door was so impregnated with diesel emissions that air wouldn't pass through it. It was completely blocked. So what was that doing to you? In the kitchen, we were cooking cabbage rolls. So you know the first couple of leaves that you get off cabbage rolls is the big leaf that goes like that.
The nicest ones.
Yeah. So people put them on and started wearing. So everybody's going around the station wearing cabbage rolls for leaves, and the captain's going around the station punching everybody that's got one on. Sometimes it was actually cruel. You know, you try and figure out which stories you can tell and which you can't. But they're all terrific memories. And you know what? Chris Phillips retiring just recently, wonderful guy, and he brought it all flooding back when he was talking about hockey players playing practical jokes. Well, there was no better practical jokers than the fire station.
Well, share with us, John.
Okay, number 4 station, which is Industrial in Saint Laurent, closed now, I believe. There's no station there anymore. It was the front of the training center. I was sleeping with a particular individual who is contributing greatly to this ROFA at the present time, and we got to sleep at night. So every now and then you took a turn on late watch. So when you were on late watch, this particular individual didn't sleep very well, and the theory behind sleeping was that if you got a call at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, you would be partially rested so that you could respond to the call. Well, what we did was we had this old King Seagrave aerial that had a large bell mounted on the front of it. So we ran a thread from the bedroom upstairs down across the apparatus floor to the striker on this bell. Well, this particular individual that was on late watch didn't sleep well in the fire station at the best of times. So what we would do is we'd lie up in the bedroom and pull this thread and get the striker in the bell going, and if you could get a ring out of it, and then you'd stop, and you knew he would get up and go and see what the heck's going on. And he couldn't see the thread because there was no lights on. And then you give him half an hour to go back to bed, and you'd do it again. Well, guess what? Nobody slept the whole night.
Oh my goodness.
And water fights. Well, so.
Not the water fights that we think of.
Not the water fights we think of. New station opened up on McCarthy Road. And
it was named after you, of course.
McCarthy on McCarthy. They stationed me there just so that I'd know where to go to work. Anyway, a relatively young crew, but the way you congealed as a group of men put together a lot of times had to do with the fooling around that you did in the station. So this one particular time, it starts off with a water fight. So the guy washing the pump has got the sponge, right? So he turns around, he's got the sponge, and what ends up is somebody goes walking by and he throws the wet sponge at him and he hits him. So then that guy runs back and he goes and gets the Windex bottles, and he takes the Windex out and he fills it with water and puts it on straight stream, comes around the corner of the pump and squirts the guy washing the pump. Well, then the fun is on. The chase is going through the station. So you're up the stairwells, across the bedrooms, back down the pole hole, all across the station, running all around, chasing each other with these water bottles. Well, then somebody else wants to get in. So in this particular case, somebody laid a line from the standpipe in the apparatus floor. And as the individual came through the apparatus doors, hit him full stream with the... You never fight with the guy that's got the biggest hose.
Now, of course, the Safety 23, that would not be allowed.
No, fooling around in the station is not allowed. But then that was before safety officers.
Absolutely.
Another funny story that comes to mind is, his name's escaping me right now.
It might be best that it does.
Okay. I'm on the roof of a building and we're fighting a fire. I've got an 1.5-inch line, and I forget hot spots here and there. with an 1.5 inches. Every now and then, you get directly hit with a 2.5 inches that's coming from the ground. So I turn around and I'm trying to see, and I see the guy who's got the 2.5 inches. Bob Mullins. So I take the 1.5 inches and I give him a shot with the 1.5 inches because he's been sulking us with the 2.5 inches. But I'm still a relatively young guy on the job, and he's an older guy. And if you knew Bob Mullins, he was a great guy. He ran the fishing hole at Holland and Wellington for many, many years. An avid outdoorsman, trapper, lived up in Constance Bay. He sees this young lad hit him with the nozzle. So he drops the nozzle and he's coming to get me. Well, you know why you had to have 2 ladders on a building? One was for him coming up to get you, and the other was for you going down running away from him. Yeah. So you kept doing the circuit until he ran and he couldn't catch you anymore. So.
Well, the stories that we can continue telling here would just go on and on, and I just love it, John. But I want to thank you for your time today.
It's been a treat.
It certainly has been, and it'll be a treat for people that are going to listen to this. So, again, it won't stop here. We'll continue at the museum in the near future.
Well, you know you're getting old when Dave McAvoy comes and interviews you.
All right. Thanks so much, John.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Chase, find a sunny place, go and paint your face with sunshine, pay your doctor bills, throw away his pills, you can cure your ills with sunshine. Why don't you take your teardrops one by one before it gets too late, and hang them up out in the sun, and they'll evaporate when the trouble starts.